Welcome to the workshop. We are going to start now. Welcome, Amy and Claire.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Claire and I can't get too close to each other because we're both wearing headsets. And if we get closer than 2 meters, we will make a lot of noise. So we're not staying away from each other for any other reason. And I also wanted to say that I think we are the living embodiment of what we're trying to do about what Digby was saying, which is that there has been a lot of misogyny in existential therapy and in psychotherapy in general. We're working very hard at having the female voices heard, as are many other people in this room. Long may it last. So today we will be speaking about structural existential analysis, better known as SEA, which is a qualitative research methods based in phenomenology and in existential philosophy. And in that sense, it is unique. There are many phenomenological qualitative research methods, but none of them combined it with existential philosophy ideas. This is a very structured way of understanding what we are seeing when we do research.
And I think it's really important to bring the existential part into a research methodology, because when we look at the other phenomenological research methodology, they stick very much to the phenomenology. And what we discovered through our own research and work is that a lot of existential issues emerge, and there's a real need to place that in the research. And I know Van Manen has tried very much to do that in his lived experience research methodology, but it's always like the existential was a bit of an add-on after the research, like, oh, well, you could look at the existential dimensions, whereas we want to really embed it as part of a research methodology.
Right. So it's all about making sense of a person's experience, because qualitative research is all about investigating how people experience the world, how they are living their lives. So basically, people investigate significant events that have happened to people, and then we need to find a method to capture that, make sense of it, and get some data out of it that allow us to speak with equality with the research community without doing violence to our existential phenomenological ideas.
So it's really important to think about the philosophical method as a way of exploring our being in the world. And if we think back to Digby's last presentation, he was talking very much about Binswanger's ideas. And I think that's a really good way in which you can start thinking about, you know, that we're always situated in a world, in a context. And so a lot of what we're trying to do in therapeutic work as well is just trying to understand a person's worldview. You know, we're never without our context, we're never without our relationships. And so we need to encompass all of those elements in therapy, but also in research as well. And I think, again, when we look at other research methodologies, they kind of ignore maybe the emotional dimension of somebody's experience, or they might not look at things like, you know, the paradoxes that come out in people's experiences. So all of this is part of what we do therapeutically, working as existential therapists.
And it's always about meaning and how people create meaning in the world and attribute meaning to the things that are happening to them. These are hard things to capture. It's not easy to do. And let us say, this is a work in progress. This is not written in stone. This is constantly being updated because of the work that our doctoral students are doing, experimenting with the methods. So one very important part of our SEA research is that we emphasize the collection of data as a vital moment, a key part of the process. It's not just about doing some kind of semi-structured interview. It is about using our existential psychotherapeutic skills, our ability to get close and personal with the other person and be in a dialogue with them, so as to get as much detailed information and as much in-depth, meaningful information from them as we can. So questions will be raised about their psychopathology, perhaps, but we look at that as their mode of being. Questions will be raised about how they live their life, and we will look at that in terms of ontodynamics rather than psychodynamics, and it will be all about their values, their meanings, their connections to the world at many different levels.
So as I was just saying before about Binswanger, we need a bit of a map for research. And I think quite often a lot of our students go to something like IPA as a research methodology because it feels really safe. It's all nicely described, the steps. And so for novice researchers, it feels like this is a really good way in which I can examine and research lived experience in a very structured way. And any research has to be structured. You know, we can't just take 15 pages of transcript, you know, and then try and work out how we're going to turn that into something meaningful. So there needs to be a structure, even if we're doing, you know, sort of pure phenomenology in the way that philosophers would do it. And I think there's sometimes been a bit of criticism about using these dimensions as a structures because they're saying, well, you're forcing the data into a particular dimension. But actually, however we do it, we're going to be dividing the data up in a particular way. And we're not forcing data into, you know, the personal, social, physical or spiritual.
Distributed across different boxes.
Exactly, you know, and also some bits at the initial part, which we'll come on to later, may well be in each dimension. And then we can kind of work with that as it is. But going back to this, you know, as in life, and Emmy always talks about it really nicely in her work around, you know, therapeutic practice, is that we need a framework to work, but we also need a kind of a map of the person's life world. And so this is what we've got here. We can think about the person in their larger context. So we have the individual, they belong to a family, they belong to peer groups, they belong to a society, a state, institutions, they're part of a culture, ideology, politics, and we're all part of nature. And all of those different aspects will come into play in our therapeutic rooms, but also when we're looking at lived experience as a researcher, we need to bring those bits in as well.
So from the start, we structure our research as being dimensional. It's not going to be one thing. It's not going to be binary. It's not going to be either this or that. It's going to be at many different levels, and those levels will be interwoven. Now, we're not going to do this, don't worry, but when we present this, we just want to, when we have an audience that isn't existential therapists, we just need to remind people of the existential background, because so often people still question this existential approach, especially to research. Who are you to come up with an alternative way of doing research? Well, there is this long tradition, you know, and it is a tradition from all over the world. And we could elaborate on this quite a bit because there are loads of people missing there who worked in Russia or in South America. We can show the deep roots of our existential work. And here are some of the most famous ones that most people are aware of, and that even they might recognize by their photographs. I think that's enough said about that.
But also the practitioners are also really important as well. So I guess, again, the reason we're sort of talking about the philosophy is because all of our lives have existential dimensions. So we can think about that in terms of ontological structures of a certain experience. When we're doing the research, we might want to draw on, you know, particular philosophical ideas to really try and bring something out about what this experience means, not just from what it's like on an ontic level, you know, what that experience is like for a person, but also to try and understand something around that ontological experience as well. And I know there's a kind of a difficulty in qualitative research because we can say, well, it's just such small numbers, we can't possibly universalize these findings. And then we can maybe, if we're looking at ontological structures, then in some ways we are sort of going towards that, aren't we? You know, we might be sort of saying, well, maybe there is some universality in that, but maybe not on that ontic level of that individual experience, but more, what are we trying to understand at this different level, this ontological level?
And the reason we also draw on the practitioners is because we're going to use those methods and those ways of working with people in a very intimate way in our dialogue with the research participants, and B, because they have provided us with many new concepts and new ideas from which to understand what is being said to us. So the psychotherapeutic practice is directly relevant to the research practice. And that is also a novel idea. But as we've heard earlier in the conference, Ronnie Lang used to speak about this because he said that psychotherapy is essentially a form of research, because with each and every person we work with, we are together researching something about their life, their experience, their relationships, their connections, their worldview, and also finding out some of the things that aren't said, that are invisible, and that we want to bring into the visible area, into what can be said. So we need all that practice. And this leaves us with one little problem, which is that it becomes almost impossible for someone who isn't trained as an existential psychotherapist to do SEA research properly, because it takes quite a bit of time to learn to interact with people at that depth and to listen that carefully. So we do need to bear that in mind and provide training for people who want to do SEA research that isn't turning them into psychotherapists, but which nevertheless will convey to them some of that wisdom of existential therapy.
So again, sort of following on from what Emmy was saying, we're looking at using existential methods of practice in a research way. And I think Emmy's work on the 4 dimensions as a framework for working with clients has a long history as a really good way of us understanding an individual's experience. And we've also got this systematic way of looking at it and creating these filters and these lenses through which we're going to look through the data. So it's really important to think about it in terms of what we can learn as practitioners, in terms of the dialogue that we create with our research participants in order to access the data, or capture, as we might call it.
Yes.
And then what we do with the analysis, which is really the filtering through these different filters and lenses, where we can kind of look at the transcript from these different angles to try and bring out something more than if you just looked for themes, you know, in one way.
And in the book, we go through each of those lenses and each of those filters in a very careful way so that you can follow the process and you can learn to do that for yourself. We hope that the book will be out sometime this autumn. We're just having to write the final chapter, but we thought we'd do that after the Congress. That was just an excuse, really, but we'll do it after the Congress. So the other thing we did in writing the book is that we did our own piece of SEA research so that we could use that as an illustration to show people how it is done at each step of the way. And we very usefully picked the topic of freedom for that research, which was a pleasure to do, and which was also then very helpful to me as I was writing a book on freedom. So I was secretly getting extra information about people's experience of their freedom. It was really interesting stuff, wasn't it?
It was,
Yes.
and this is why it's taken such a long time to write the book as well, because we've had to do the research as well as the writing. But it's been it's been very interesting to really map it out in a systematic way.
Right. So as existential researchers, we observe, we listen, we look. We observe the way in which people actually live and engage with the world. We're not trying to push them this way or that way. Like with all research, we remain outside of that and we try to collect as carefully as possible what is the case in reality for the people we interact with. And of course, it is about eventually bringing all the strands that we separate out back together again so that we have a full picture of how that works out for the person in their daily life. Yes, we can separate it into this, that, and the other, and we can split it up and we can analyze it, but we can also back synthesize it. And that's what we'll be doing in that final chapter.
Yeah, I always like to think about it as like an hourglass in some ways. You know, we've got this huge amount of data which we start off with, which is the transcript. Then we sort of funnel it down into some kind of essence or themes or sort of, you know, this raw, really reduced reductions, and we'll come on to the reductions. And then we need to kind of expand it out where we add in the existential philosophy and really trying to, you know, I suppose if you're thinking about it from a research write-up, it's where you kind of really expand it in your findings, where you're and discussion, where you're bringing in those existential dimensions and expanding the understanding from, you know, the theme titles can give us a little bit, but then we have to put some meat on that to give the real understanding of what that experience is
To
about.
make it meaningful, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right. So I think this is important to remember that looking at things from an existential perspective is always going to involve observing the tensions of life. It's never going to be about looking at things from one perspective. It's always about going around the houses until we've got a hold of those polarities, those contradictions, those dilemmas, and those conflicts. And we all know what they are. There are many more than those, of course, but that's in the back of our minds, as it were. That's our existential commitment, not to be fooled by surface things, but look under the surface for these things that we know are there. And this is what you were talking about already, isn't it, Claire? About bringing it back together and synthesizing.
Yeah, so it's this kind of pulling things apart and then putting things back together. And again, I think some of the difficulties that our novice researchers find is that they get too caught up in the story that our participants are telling us. You know, our participants will be giving us lots and lots of examples of their lived experience. And it's quite easy to get caught up in those stories and to really think about, well, that's going to be the theme, is the story. And we've almost got to forget the story and try to get down to what we were talking about. I can't remember who said it now in the conference, but somebody said, you know, the essence of the experience. We've got to get down to what is really going on underneath. What is this experience about that has come up in these different life narratives?
So this is about how we actually approach being in the interview with people. And I like this metaphor about going on a country walk with them. Incidentally, that's a very Heideggerian thing, isn't it? Heidegger used to love talking about conversations on a walk, on a path. And that is pretty much what existential philosophy is like. We go on this path together with the people we interview. And we go slowly.
Yeah.
And we make sure that we look around very carefully every step of the way.
And I think it's important about the interview because this is the most important part of any research, because that's where you get your data. And again, I've had students who will come and say, oh, I've done my interview. And then when you start looking at it, you see there's so many missed opportunities. There's so many bits where the student hasn't kind of followed up on. And I think, again, we get caught out in this idea of a semi-structured interview, that students will come up with their questions and then think that they've got to rigidly hold on to them in some way.
Yes.
But actually what we're suggesting is that we should have some prompts. We need some kind of structure on the interview to make sure that we're focused onto the phenomena or the research question that we're interested in exploring. But we also need to be unstructured. Yes. And need to go with where our participant is taking us. Yes. And go in deeper as well. So we don't just, again, it's very similar to existential therapy. We don't just stick at the surface and just accept what they're saying. We've got to try and get down into the understanding of what it was actually like for them.
I think this is a key point. So over the years of doing research with doctoral students, I have been terribly frustrated and saying to them, but why didn't you ask whether also the opposite was true? Or why didn't you ask how they came to feel that way? Or why didn't you explore in further depth? And as Claire says, so many missed opportunities. It's so frustrating when you have learned as a therapist to do all those things. So what happens? It's like, I'm doing qualitative research. Now I've got to be really kind of neutral, and I've got to be really staying with what I'm doing, stick with the research questions, and not be in a real relationship with this person. So we've thrown all of that out of the window. Because we have so much structure at the other end, we can afford to go into the depths. Because we're secure in the knowledge that there will be that discipline and that will all be caught. It will all come out in the wash. Yes, we can have an interesting conversation. I remember when I was doing some of the interviews for the freedom research we were doing, sometimes I noticed when I looked back over the protocols and what you'd written up there, I realized that with each of the people I interviewed, there was a point where I allowed myself to actually start talking about myself and say, yes, I really recognize that. I've had that experience too, when I've been on a journey, that there have been points where I felt completely free, but on the other end, it felt as if nobody would care if I died. Nobody would know where I was. And there was this incredible paradox of being both released of belonging and no longer having to account for myself and going where I wanted to go on the one hand, and on the other hand, knowing that I'd lost my identity in a way and that nobody cared anymore. And maybe that was also part of that freedom. So I didn't say all of that, but you know, it's like when you allow yourself to think and to feel and to remember what the other is talking about and how that is meaningful for you, then you are liberating your participant to actually start telling you what they really think about it and what was really happening. And each time it led into that, didn't it? So by liberating ourselves from the semi-structured interview, we have opened up Pandora's box. And we've got a very good box at the end of it to catch all that material and to work with it.
But we've also got a very good box at the beginning of it as well. I don't know if it's the next slide,
Yes. Yeah.
but it's around how we deal with our own reflexivity. So that's really the kind of the key bit at the beginning of any research. Maybe I'll just stop there, and when we get this come to the slide, I'll bring.
But this we need to say again and again to teach the researcher to connect with the topic and to care about the topic and to be in the research interviews in an authentic way rather than in this imitation I'm a researcher way. That gets you the good stuff. You wanted to talk to that? Oh, you meant another slide. The next.
No, it's fine. We can. I think this is important as well, because I think what we're looking at is this idea of ontodynamics rather than psychodynamics. So again, when we think about social research, we might be trying to understand it from a psychological perspective, but actually, again, coming from an existential psychotherapeutic perspective, we're looking at how we are moving in time and that there are many different aspects to that.
Yes, so the structure of what we are examining in that person's life needs to be captured in some way. And how do we do that? We know how we do that. We ask the person to describe and to be very precise about it and to ask questions about what does that mean to you or what was that like for you? It's all the stuff we take from our psychotherapeutic practice. We export it straight into the research. And as I was saying, that is something that takes some time to learn. That doesn't come natural to investigators, but it delivers the goods. It is about really locating, identify, and putting into perspective, and to even push at people on their assumptions and on their values, and checking out whether we are understanding that correctly. Is that really how it was for them? Is that how they felt about it? What was that about? How did that fit with their overall understanding of how the world works? So I think it's time to get down to actually the method, probably, Claire.
Yeah, although we've talked a lot about it already. But yes, what we're trying to do is taking elements of phenomenological research and applying it in a systematic way, adding in an existential
Here we are.
part.
This is the great reveal. This is structural existential analysis in a nutshell. And we like to think of it, well, I like to think of it as the 5 Ps and space and time. So we investigate space, we investigate time, we use phenomenology, we use philosophical methodology, we keep track of the paradoxes, conflicts, and dialectics. We keep track of the emotions, and we keep track of the person's intentionality, their values, and their purpose. That's it. That's all you do. So you could work it out for yourself if you're an existential therapist, because you're doing all that with your clients all the time. But to apply it to disciplined research, we need to be a little bit more, let's say, careful about it. So this is another way to put that together. So at the bottom, the foundation, we have phenomenology, the idea of paradox. Everything is always energetically distributed as polarities and paradoxes, and energy that moves between them. And philosophy. Those are our foundations. Out of those come some of the methodological things of the reductions and our existential dialogue. And then we build on there, looking at these things separately. Passion, that's the emotions. Purpose, that's your intentionality and your values. Space, which is the 4 dimensions. And time, which is the 4 dimensions of time.
And I think what we're trying to do is really, again, expand out, very much kind of echoing Binswanger's original ideas of, not just seeing a person from one particular perspective. If we use these different lenses, then what we're doing is we're taking the transcript and we're just shifting it and looking again, is something else revealed in that shift, and we do it again, and we keep doing it to see whether we can bring more things out so that we get a much richer description of the experience, and we don't just get caught up in, sort of quite narrow lines.
I find that now that we've got this much more compact model, I use that in my supervision sessions with my students, also with my clinical supervision sessions, because it allows me to remember that when they're telling me the story of where they are with their clients, I can make supervisory remarks coming in from all those different angles. And at each of those moments, they start to look at the client's material from a different perspective. So it starts with Husserl, well, as Digby reminded us, with Franz Brentano, really good old Edmund Husserl. He's a champion, not so well known perhaps, but he's the father of phenomenology. And aren't we totally dependent on that method? So his idea of the Wesensschau, that we have to go to the things themselves and look for the essence, so often misunderstood, where people who just come to phenomenology think phenomenology is about the phenomena as they shine out at us. Yes, that's how we approach it. But what we do is that we look at what is there at the surface, and then we go under the surface and we penetrate to the essence. That's the Wesenschau. And the idea of Franz Brentano about intentionality, we come back to that in a sec. And the idea that we need to question the natural attitude of already knowing what things mean and learning to tune back into our intuition, our direct grasp of whether something actually makes sense or not. It's amazing, isn't it? When you allow yourself to just pause for a moment and think, does this make sense to me? Does that feel right? And it gives you a very good idea of something feeling it falls into place or something still needing to be questioned. So there are lots of things about our intuition that we can do better. And that leads to the idea that knowledge always begins with experience, and it has got to lead back to experience. If it isn't relevant to an ordinary person's life and it doesn't make them feel they grasp things better, is that knowledge even worth having? And of course, it's the big idea of bracketing assumptions. Right, so let's have a go at that. So let's start with the assumptions and prejudices in our participants, but of course also in our researchers. And when we supervise researchers, we need to spend a great deal of time having them talk about their assumptions about this research. And there are always huge numbers of assumptions, aren't there? Mm-hmm. And in our PAP Vivas, with the PAP Viva, so the PAP Viva is the initial Viva that the student has as they're starting on their research and they've done a research proposal and they need to explain to outside people who don't know about their research why this makes sense and how they're going to go about it. So for them to be ready for that, they need to have been able to challenge what they are doing in themselves. What's my motivation? What am I really looking for? What am I trying to force my participants to say? And how am I going to stop doing that and actually make myself available to find out what their real experience is?
Because I think that's the challenge, isn't it? When you're thinking about a piece of research, it's almost in your mind that you never actually stop at the question. You've always jumped ahead to what you think the answer might be. And so that's the tricky bit, is to try and stop yourself doing that. But maybe we can't stop ourselves. So then we have to just be aware that we are doing that. You know, what is the answer? What are the things that we think that we want to find out of a piece of research? And we need to document that. You know, Emmy and I, for the freedom research, we interviewed each other about our experience of freedom as a way of kind of capturing what our preconceptions and what our own experience and our own assumptions and our own judgments about this piece of research was right from the beginning, before we even started talking to participants. So we've got it there, out there at the beginning, so we can look at, well, what kind of ideas
and
do we have?
incidentally, I think it really helped that there were two of us doing this with one another in a dialogue, rather than having one researcher and a supervisor. Because there is something about working things out in dialogue that helps us get closer and closer in, because both people are implicated and they challenge each other. Okay? Right, so here we come to the idea of SOAR or SOAR. You're going to speak to that?
Yeah. So this is really what we've been talking about. And this is the phenomenological part of it, because when we think about doing phenomenology, we're not philosophers sitting in our little huts, maybe in the Black Forest, pondering existence on our own and answering these kind of questions through our own thinking. That was kind of how phenomenology is used in philosophy. But we're not doing that. We're asking our participants to give us some information, and we are the kind of the conduit of the phenomenology. How we are with our participants is going to draw something out that we can then answer that kind of question. So we need to really kind of focus in on Husserl's ideas around how we can kind of bracket our experience. So it's about creating the state of mind. And again, very similar to existential psychotherapy. We go into meeting our clients in the same way. We're trying to leave our assumptions about what their lives might mean at the door and to be open and receptive to whatever they bring us. So we've really got to try and orientate ourselves in the world and in terms of our points of view and our emotional state and our mood and disposition in order to be aware of all of that, so that when we're meeting our participants, we are also aware of that kind of experience that's going on for us internally. So it's like having two conversations almost. You're listening to your participant or your client, and you're also listening to yourself and reflecting on what's going on in that way. So we kind of have to orientate ourselves to the research. And obviously that orientation is also based on our worldviews and our beliefs and our theoretical belief system, our perspective and our cultural bias. So again, we need to be really careful about that in the interview. So when a participant says something, we need to think about how we're responding to that person. If we agree with that person, we might not bother asking any more questions. We might just think, oh yeah, I understand what you're talking about. Let's move on. But actually, that's kind of where we need to really raise a flag and think, no, it's where there's some similarity between the two of us, where we need to probe a bit further and just make sure that we're not missing anything. I think sometimes it's so much easier working with somebody who's completely different from us because we instinctively ask more questions because we don't know what it's like. So it's really about trying to get to that attitude and that state of mind so that we're just really aware of our biases. And I think Emmy gives a really good description of bracketing, which I use quite a lot when I'm teaching, is that, when we put things in brackets, it's not to kind of delete them, but it's actually that we need to work that bit out first before we can do the other part of the equation. In maths, that's kind of how you do it, apparently. So, so there's something about this attitude that we have to take. So although when we meet the participant, it's very much in this unstructured way where we're really going with the participant's experience and we're not kind of feeling constrained by, asking particular types of questions. We also have to be mindful of how we're doing that, and that we need to be thinking about how we're stopping that kind of bias also coming in, so that we're just really opening up again, like Binswanger talks about in the dimensions, that we're trying to create this bigger worldview that's going to come out of the interviews.
And finally, we need to be aware of our situation, the interaction between ourselves and the participant, and whether we are getting provoked into side taking by some things they say, which we might not like to hear. So these are all things about finessing how we are actually going to be in that dialogue, that research dialogue.
I think that, I just want to pick up on that bit because I think it's really important that, and I think it kind of comes to this bit as well, that quite often in research, you do find something that you don't necessarily want to find out, or that you get surprised about. And so I think, again, we have to, as researchers, be open to allow ourselves to have that experience, that actually we might find the opposite of what we wanted to find.
Hopefully.
Or we might find, so yes, exactly. Or we might find something that's, you know, that we don't like.
Yes. It's good to be surprised. That's what research is about, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we like using the Johari window, which is from Gestalt psychology, not Gestalt psychotherapy, which is that some things are known to others and known to self, and we call those open things. Everybody knows them, but that doesn't mean we can take them for granted. They still need to be said. But from there, the research leads us, hopefully, to all these other boxes, to the things that were not known to the person, the participant. So they find out something new about themselves by talking to us in the dialogue. And also, of course, we will find out some things that were not known to others, the things that were hidden. And then, most of all, what we love to do is to discover things that were neither known to the participant nor to the researcher, that together in that research dialogue, we're figuring out something new. And it amazes me when that happens. And it is so absolutely wonderful that so many students do get these moments where they think, oh, that's how it works. And that the person they interviewed also say, I had never realized that is what happened to me. And that is what makes research worth doing. So we go back to the basic phenomenology, the Brentano idea of intentionality. So this is the fundamental idea of intentionality, which is very, very simple. It is that consciousness is something that happens by a subject going out towards an object in the world, and there being this intentional arc. The intentional arc is subject, a predicate, and an object. And so we always make sense of our experience through the intentional arc. And so to do phenomenology thoroughly, you need to be specific about how you look at what's happening to the subject, what is happening to the action, to the predicate, and what is happening to the object, which is why we have 3 layers. Now, Husserl spoke about that in various ways, but he liked to talk about the subject in Latin terminology because of the Cartesian cogito ergo sum. So he talked about the subject as the cogito. And to get to that, he devised something called the transcendental reduction. We come back to that. Then there is the noesis, which he also called the cogitatio. So the noesis is the Greek word, which is the process of thinking. And I believe that is still the case in modern Greek, if I'm not mistaken. So the noesis is the Greek term for that. And in Latin, that was the cogitatio, the process of I think. And so that we capture by the phenomenological reduction. And then there are the noema, or the plural, the noemata, which can also be called the cogitationes in Latin. And that's about the objects, and that we capture with the eidetic reduction. So, summary, phenomenological reduction, the noesis, the cogitatio, it's about the process of the person's consciousness. The eidetic reduction is the noema, the cogitationes, the objects of what the person is experiencing, and the transcendental reduction in relation to the person themselves, their inner experience of who they are, what Michel Henry calls inner phenomenology or a phenomenology of interiority, but it is a part of phenomenology that is very often neglected. But we need to capture it and be sure to include it. Right, now how much are we going to say about this stuff? Do we have time for all of that? There's a lot to say.
I think, well, we've got half an hour and we want to spend time for
so
some
we
questions.
won't do that now, but if you have questions at the end, we're happy to go back to it and look at that in more detail. So this is about the process of the phenomenological reduction. Okay, so that's about the noesis. And and this is about the eidetic reduction, and this is about the transcendental reduction. So all of these are laid out very carefully so that you know how to apply that, which might actually be quite handy if you're doing phenomenological work with your clients as well. So maybe our book on research methods will also turn out to be quite useful for other things. But let's turn to the philosophical methods, which we refer to all the time, and which takes us back to Plato's cave, you know, the ideal of the philosopher, the wise philosopher who goes probing back into the cave where the human beings are chained to a wall, guessing at what things in the world mean, when they can be released from their chains and taken out of the cave to actually look at the things themselves as they actually are, because that really is the model of the philosophical side of existential phenomenological work. Shall I carry on with this bit and then you take over?
Yeah.
Okay. So the philosophical methods that we use there, you're all familiar with ontology versus the ontic, yeah? That we separate out when we speak about things that are actually happening to people or that are actually the case for people now in their daily lives. Those are ontic things. Those are concrete things in the world. When we speak about ontological matters, we're talking about what is the case for being. It's a kind of metaphysical discussion. It's about what makes being possible. So these things we bear in mind. We use meiotics, which we also do in existential therapy. We bring out what is hidden in people. Meiotics, you know what that means? It's midwifery. It's the art of bringing babies into the world. Claire's speciality. It is about finding the knowledge and the wisdom that people have about their lives and themselves and the world, and helping them give birth to it so that together we can allow this wisdom out in the world. It's like releasing it from the cave, as it were. So that is done by Socratic dialogue. So we will use some of the ideas of how to conduct a Socratic dialogue in the research dialogue as well. We also use hermeneutic ideas, which, as you know, is the science of interpretation. Originally was applied to the science of interpretation of the Bible in particular. But since then, in philosophy, it's become a much more in-depth idea about there being many different ways of interpreting material. So to interpret material not in terms of a pre-established idea or a dogma, but to be open to many possible interpretations and to work in dialogue with the other person to figure out what interpretations they actually put onto things. Then there is the heuristic methodology, which is, as you probably know, to learn to check back with your own intuition, your own gut feelings about how things are, like the example I gave of saying to people, oh yeah, that's what it is like sometimes when you travel and you feel free, but also at the same time you feel a bit lost. So you get this paradox that comes in because you go with your own experience and you're not afraid to use some of your experience in that work, as long as you go back to the other person's experience using hermeneutic ideas rather than imposing your interpretation. And then finally, of course, good old dialectics. It is never this or that. It is always this and that. So if I have to make compromises or I have to try to have this way or that way, I am not on the right path yet. When I can see that something is sometimes this and sometimes that, and it is both those things at the same time, it's not just binary, it's not either or, it's not a monism either, it's many things. Life is complex, diverse, and we need to find a way to have all those facets in our analysis, because that's how we capture the total picture. Claire.
So, space. This is one of the key things. So a lot of our students at the new school, when they're looking at their research, they're really interested in the kind of the space that we occupy. You know, we're always occupying a different kind of space, whether that's the physical, in our social space, personal space, and spiritual space. And it's really important to think about this from a developmental perspective as well. So we start off in a very physical way, being born, and we just connect through embodiment. And then we start creating kind of social connections with other people. And out of those social connections with the world and others, we start creating a sense of who we are as a person. And then out of that personal dimension is our spiritual element, which is really about our values and our beliefs, our purpose, our motivations, all of those kinds of things. And so the way that we can kind of think about it is that the physical dimension is always going to be one of the larger ones, and the spiritual a smaller element, but all four dimensions are always going to be in everybody's experience in some ways. And sometimes it may be like that, or maybe, you know, there may be the social dimension is larger.
Sometimes the social connection may squash a person's personal and spiritual connections. Some people might never really develop an inner world that holds together. Some people might never come to have that inner reflection that allows you to create a system of meaning for yourself. So they might just live with a social structure of meaning. And all of that is relevant when you do research. You got to fish that out. You got to figure out what you're watching, what you're seeing.
So again, we've got here, physical is around things, objects in the world. Social is about our relationship with other people. Personal is very much about our relationship with ourselves. And then the spiritual is about our relationship with ideas. So we have our kind of experience, and then we have our relational element. And then we have how we encounter life. So again, same kind of thing. We're looking at it now in terms of the Umwelt, Mitwelt, Eigenwelt, and Überwelt. And we can look at it in a different way here. So in each of these dimensions, we can kind of think about it in terms of polarities. So very much, as Emmy was saying about, you know, those dialectical positions that we're caught in, those different tensions that we have in life and death, survival and world, communication and others, thoughts and strengths and weaknesses.
This is really important. These paradoxes, these tensions at each level. So I remember sitting in vivas where people talk about, oh, I'm researching people who have been raped. And of course, they're victimized and they feel weak. And the immediate question is, where are we here? If they feel weak, are we at the personal level? Have we forgotten to look at what's happened to their bodies? So what are you doing with that investigation? And what has happened to their social role in the world? And if you're saying they're weak because they're victimized, has it occurred to you that they may actually have derived a kind of angry strength from that as well? And how are you going to approach this research project so that you're not just going to capture their victimhood and their weakness, but you're also going to invite them to investigate how they have come out of that with greater vigor and greater strength? So having these sorts of things in mind helps you finding yourself on the map of the research project, and it helps you trace things that are being forgotten or things that would be useful.
So I think it really helps to give this 360-degree view. That's what we're trying to do, is like trying to look at things from lots of different perspectives. And so all of these ideas just are little markers to make sure that, are we just looking at it from one direction? Do we need to look at it from another angle? You know, is there a different perspective that we need to zone in on?
So this is the Umwelt, Mietwelt, Eigenwelt and Überwelt set against the 4 dimensions, looking at what happens in terms of survival, physical survival at each of those levels. And you see, you focus on different elements. So you could use this as a framework for analyzing your data, because you can sift your data through each of those boxes and see how much a person is interested in any of those 16 qualities. And that's very revealing, because it tells you not just what level they're at, but what part of each level they're preoccupied with. And it also might help you asking astute questions in the interview when you realize not all of that is being looked at. We have lots of these kinds of maps to help you do these things, you know, which tell you what you will find in the Umwelt at the physical level, in nature. You have to look at how the person is with the earth, with the climate, with the weather, with the seasons, with animals, with plants, with shelter, with hygiene, with sleep, with competence in facing a range of dangers, with materiality, with birth. Claire would say natality and death, what you call that? Mortality,
Yes.
and sensory experience. So for each of those, there are already existing existential experiences that are predictably going to be met by each person throughout their life. Well, in this particular situation, where are they? Where are they in that map of human existence? So what is this person like? What is their world like? What is the layered structure of their existence? What is the layered structure of their existence? And here is an example. Do you need the clicker at this point?
Okay. So this is what, oh yeah, no feedback, that's good. So this is what we're just trying to look at. You know, again, as I was saying before, we're going to have this huge transcript of your interview, and then you've got to start thinking, right, what am I actually going to do with this? All of these things. So we're kind of borrowing from other philosophical, phenomenological practices, because why reinvent the wheel? And what we're looking at is just trying to identify straight away meaning units, which really means pretty much everything in the transcript will be a meaning, you know, have some meaning. So we need to just kind of split that out. And then for each thing, either each sentence or each little paragraph, we need to start thinking about what is going on here. So for the first one, I've put, this is something that was in the transcript, and that's about all I can remember, a bit like a dream, but it really, really happened. But I never told anyone. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't go, hey, guess what? No, it was private. So this was something about an experience that they had just described. So from that, we made some little notes on a separate column about parts of that meaning, you know, the fact that it was a bit like a dream, that it was a private experience, and start to kind of have some tentative, you know, at this stage, it's really, really tentative, you know, well, that part seems to be relating to a personal dimension around that private experience, that bit's like spiritual dimension. And so we can do the same for the whole of the transcript. And so it's really just about trying to divide the transcript up and just allocating very tentatively them in these different lenses. And then once you've kind of done it across ways, horizontally, if you put all of the lenses as columns, you've got them there. And then you'll look vertically down into each dimension. And then you start looking at how you might bring things together. So for the physical dimension, for example, here are some of the things. So these are different bits of the experience. So there was something around the heart beating faster, suddenly had a feeling, knelt down and kissed the grass, response to nature, sun was shining, different from other girls physically, forever having the wrong body image, no connection to feeling of being in my body. I think, hey, I'll be gone, dead. Thought of dead is horrible, feeling over the line and feeling over the hill.
This gives you some idea of the interesting discussions we had with our research participants.
So then we need to regroup these to try and bring out what it was that was some of the kind of essence of that. So we could have got caught up in the description. So the participant gave a description of kind of in their feeling of freedom was kissing the grass and as a child, and that at that moment kind of really encapsulated it. So we could have just stuck with that experience, but actually what we wanted to try and do is find, well, what was it about freedom? So we need to keep the phenomena, the research question in our minds and try to bring that back in. So there was something around freedom suddenly arising and involving connection. And that actually that death was the limit of freedom. So we have freedom up until the point of death.
Yes, and we found that over and over again. That when people went into the depth of their freedom experience, they also came to the limit they had in their minds, that all of that would be gone in death. That essentially being alive is a possibility of freedom.
Yeah.
Some really amazing things that people said to us, isn't it?
So then again, trying to limit these down. And I think, again, trying to think about Van Manen's ideas of the art of writing is really important, because this is something that as researchers, we need to try and communicate, you know, what is the actual essence that the person of the person's experience. And so our job as researchers is trying to put some words to that, you know, which, and I think, again, I can't remember whether it was Digby or somebody saying earlier this morning, it's really difficult to try and put words sometimes to experiences. So we're trying to find ways of which we can kind of bring something out from all of the different descriptions that had been given. And also there was something as well around some of the sentences in the transcript where you actually thought, well, that's not really related to the topic of freedom. And then you can, you know, you don't have to incorporate those. You really just need to, again, just to try and to focus on the phenomena, focus on what the essence of that, keeping in mind that research question to draw out the themes. So across the different dimensions, we now have this different way of looking at freedom. So for this participant, it was something about how freedom suddenly emerged in the physical dimension and involved connection to the world, and that death was the ultimate limit. In the social dimension, they talked and gave lots of different examples of how society restricts freedom, how expression creates freedom, and how you can be how you can get freedom when you're freed from the gaze of the others. So it's basically, again, you know, the fact that the gaze of the others can restrict freedom. On the personal dimension is that freedom is personal. It's up to the person, and they have to find their own way. And then in the spiritual dimension, and again, this is really interesting because again, this seemed to be across all participants that we interviewed. There was this real spiritual dimension to their experience of freedom, that there was something about connecting to something greater than themselves, about being otherworldly, but also about being curious in life.
Yes. And this would have been different for each of the participants. So once you've done this with a lot of participants, you will get a really good grasp of how people experience freedom.
Yeah. Okay, so
Right.
I guess we ought to crack on because we haven't got any time left.
We'll go quickly. So time, we can divide into many ways, but of course it always has past, present, future. And we like to add eternity as a fourth dimension, as Heidegger used to do. But there's also the possibility of timelessness and the possibility of parallel universes that physicists are now talking about more and more. So yeah, we go back to old Heidegger. We're not going to do all that for you today because we haven't got the time for it. But, you know, sifting back through Heidegger on time actually does help when you're going to do a piece of work where time is going to be very important. You might also want to do this kind of representation of what is happening for the person in time throughout their life, so that you record it in a up and down kind of way. Where were they in time? You might record their experience of past, present, and future at different times in their life, at each of the different dimensions. There are lots of ways in which you can play with this material and get clarity. You can use Minkowski's work, who so very kindly separated out these different experiences of time that all flow into the present, you know, the remote past, immediate past, and the immediate past, the immediate future, and the remote future, all neatly defined by our friend Eugene Minkowski, I should say, and very helpful. This is a representation of past, present, and future that we came up with when we were writing our book on existential therapy some time ago. And these three are like a double figure of 8, and people tend to go around these loops. And then if they do that a lot, they might actually find themselves in that lazy figure 8, which is the lemniscate, which is the symbol of eternity. So that was the representation we had of that, drawn by your brother, I believe.
Yes.
In our book there, and we called it the dialectic of time. So we can use this in our research. You want to say a bit about that?
I just think we need to move through. Yeah, we need to move forward.
All of this can be applied systematically so that you get a clear overview of where your participant is at in time.
So I think with this, again, when we're reading through the transcripts, what we're trying to highlight are moments when they're talking about time or temporality. And again, a similar kind of process. We're sifting through the transcripts, highlighting those moments. There are fewer ones of description of temporality than there will be in the different dimensions. And again, is trying to bring those meaning units together and trying to look at what's important. So, yeah.
Right. So next is paradox. So you know what that is. It is that life always comes in opposites, near and far, good and bad. You know, tiny children have lots of these little books where they learn about opposites. It's actually really fundamental to understanding your existence. And we know that it is the power of tension and paradox and the polarities that creates power, like a battery works in exactly that way. Thunderstorms work in exactly that way. In a way, walking is like that too, because you go from left to right, from left to right. And it's bloody hard to walk like that, isn't it? So we can look at positives and negatives and see how they come together. And we look at the tensions at each dimension, and that helps us to see what is happening dynamically, ontodynamically for the participant. And so let me just go through that, Claire, until we come to the application, because we don't have time for all this stuff, do we? But you can find it in the book. So there we are.
So again, it's really when you're reading through the transcript, just trying to keep in mind this from a paradoxical position. So we've got somebody, a participant saying, they were talking about the pandemic and saying that it, on the one hand, it stopped them from doing the things that they love, but they love not having the responsibility of doing them. So it's about trying to pick out those paradoxical statements. It's not the, one or the other. It's bringing, having those two together and just highlighting something around that we're always in paradox.
Capturing how people are not just finding something wonderful. They find something wonderful, and yet they are aware they've lost something or that they're missing out on something else. It's about capturing the reality of a person's experience rather than just zooming in on one side of it. So that helps you staying in balance. And when you're in balance, you can make progress. And then we come to the emotions. Well, you know what I'm going to produce here, the emotional compass, of course. It's all about Befindlichkeit and attunement to the world, doing justice to the realization by Heidegger in particular, but also by Sartre and many others, that being in the world is always in a mood, it's always in a tonality, and we transform the world. We are not passive about that. We may receive these things, but we also hand them through and we pass them on and we increase them or we diminish them. We play with this emotionality and this attunement all the time, as I like to play with color. And so the emotional compass is all about that attunement, and it gives you a way to record where a person is at in their attunement, whether they're united in a happy way with the things they value, or they are completely removed from them, feeling frozen, low, or sad, where they're going in this downward slope into depression and disappointment and disengagement, or whether they're swinging up through the terrible troubles of shame and envy towards anxiety, excitement, and engagement towards a value. This is a handy instrument to record what is happening with emotionality in the discourse of your participants. And I could explain this all to you in better ways, but we don't have time for that. I did it to some of the people in this room a few days ago when I did you a one-day workshop. So I hope you remember that. Yes, so there's your emotional compass with the colors that kind of fit, because the emotions are on a spectrum, exactly like the colors are. And therefore, there are opposing emotions like there are opposing colors. And there are juxtaposing ones, and the ones flow into the others. And different people have different ways of navigating the emotional landscape, and they probably are not even aware that they're doing it. So when we do the research, we aim to bring that out. And that takes a bit of doing. And there are many sort of figures you can use for that to recognize where the person is at or how their words translate into one of those different compasses. Oh yeah, this is an interesting piece of research done by one of our doctoral students who put the four emotional compasses of the four worlds together into a larger, what he called compass rose. John Bennett, this is. Some amazing research things.
So this is our what we did for our participants. So as you can see, there's an element of how worry restricts freedom, how there is fear and unhappiness. So this is kind of on the net, you know, sort of a more difficult emotional part of freedom. This is kind of like the dark side of freedom. And then actually in the more positive side, although I don't like to use positive and negative, but you know, the lighter side maybe, is that when freedom is created, that experience of freedom comes joy, happiness, and enthusiasm. So again, you can see it's very paradoxical. We can't escape the paradoxes, and we've got different elements, different emotional feelings towards freedom.
And it's fluid, and it's dynamic. And it's not one thing. And this is the trick, how to capture life in all its complexity. And I think we're getting somewhere in doing that. But as I said, it is an ongoing process and we can do better still. Now, this is about
So we've
purpose.
got 2 minutes.
Oh, God. So purpose also, we work with and we look at how people may have different purposes at different levels, and they may therefore have conflicts inside of themselves because on the one hand they want this and on the other hand they want that. And to actually be able to record that and illustrate that is a very good thing. Let's see what
I think
else?
maybe we should just stop at the moment and just open up for some questions.
Okay, let's leave it there for the moment. Okay, there's a lot more there, but we will stop there and we'll open to questions.
Yeah.
Çivili olacak. Merhaba, Türkçe soracağım, çeviri olacak değil mi? Tamamdır. Başlayabilir miyim? Öncelikle Türkiye'ye hoş geldiniz. Sunum için de çok teşekkür ederim. Çok etkileyiciydi. Ancak dikkatimi çeken bir husus olduğu için onun Türkçe karşılığını sizlerle de paylaşmak ve sesimi duyurmak istedim. Şöyle ki sık duyduğum kavram freedom. Yani bugün Türkçe'ye özgürlük olarak tercüme edilen bir kavram. Ancak şöyle bir şey fark ettim. İstanbul değil de daha bu coğrafyanın iç taraflarına doğru gittiğimizde oradaki insanların yaşamında özgürlüğün bir yere temas etmediğini, daha başka kavramlarla sanki onu ikame edebileceğimizi düşündüm. Şöyle bir şeyle karşılaştım.
Buraya kadar çevirebilir miyim? Çok pardon.
Tabii lütfen.
Thank you for the presentation. You listened to translation already, but the English speakers maybe don't have the earphones, so I have to translate for them. Thank you for the presentation. And I want to ask a question about this term freedom. When we go to the east part of Turkey, right? And freedom means different things for them.
O insanlarda makul bir zemine deneyimle birlikte ilişkilenmediğini fark ettim. Şu kısma geçeyim.
Yeah, it's not as embodied or grounded as we think how freedom is for us.
Şöyle bundan 100 yıl kadar önce bir savaş meydana geliyor ve bu savaş dışarıdan bakıldığında bir özgürlük savaşı gibi görünüyor. Yani bir
Mhm.
freedom
Yes.
çerçevesinde ele alınıyor.
So 100 years ago, there was a war in this land, and we call it actually the War of Freedom. It looks like that, but
Ancak şöyle bir adlandırma yapılmış. O zamanlar Arapçaymış gibi görünen bir kavramdan bahsedeceğim. İstiklal, Arap kaidelerine bağlı olarak türetilmiş Türkçe bir kavram. Ve taşıyıp sırtlanmak, götürmek, ileri doğru atılmak anlamına geliyor. O savaşın adı İstiklal Harbi'ydi. Bunu vurgulamak istedim.
yeah, so there is this word. I translated it as War of Freedom, but actually it's an Arabic word, and it means istiklal is taking it on your back and bringing it forward. It
Very
means
interesting.
that, and it's
Yes.
very interesting.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Unfortunately, this is not a book on freedom. We just use our little bit of research to illustrate how we do the research. But this is a very useful remark for my book on freedom. So thank you very much for that.
But I think
Thank you.
absolutely a really important point, because I guess we're coming from a very, sort of Western view of freedom. And I know, obviously you've just described a Turkish view of freedom that is just very culturally bound, but also, Fanon and some of the Black existentialists also dispute freedom. I mean, this is obviously another topic of conversation, but, we're just, as Emmy said, we're just using this as a bit of illustrative research rather than trying to make claims around freedom
Yes.
in general.
Well, and it isn't even about nationality, is it? Because that is about a different conception of freedom in Western Turkey and a different conception in Eastern Turkey as well. It's incredibly relative to one's situation, how we define freedom.
So if
Thank
you
you.
did the
Thank you so much.
research in your part of Turkey, it will be very different to the research we did in London. So,
Aslında soru olarak değil, katkı mahiyetinde sizlerle paylaşmak istedim. Tekrardan teşekkür ederim.
This was a contribution, not a question. So thank you very
Yeah,
much.
thank you.
Well, we are
On
already,
the research,
sorry.
any questions you have, if you want to use it, or yes, there's somebody there.
We are already
Yeah.
on a break, so if you want to take a break, please, you can take a
yeah,
break.
sorry that we didn't leave more time.
Hello. I think the research component is like brilliant, especially the structure of it. And I'm excited to try it out in my own terms already. And there's a lot of depth that we couldn't go through, but I'm definitely going to read through it. I have one specific question. I'm just thinking of the research paper itself, mainly the discussion of the research that I haven't decided yet. It is. So obviously you actually had a point about this on the slides as well, about like there might be some confirmation bias because we're exploring people's own assumptions about their own lives and their values.
Totally.
Confirmation bias comes with most existential qualitative studies. So to discuss this in our discussion, should I think of ways to account for confirmation bias or ways of reflecting on it?
Well, I wouldn't call it confirmation bias. I would just go with the phenomenology of it. So your subjects will have a very subjective experience of whatever it is you are researching. And that is valid in its own right, because that is their experience. And that is what you're investigating when you do existential phenomenological research. You're not doing some kind of statistical analysis to come up with the common denominator about market research. You're investigating very intimate personal experience about something. So yes, there will always be subjectivity in that, That's what you're looking at. That's what you're favoring. So you don't have to be apologetic about that at all.
So if they criticize my research limitations, confirmation bias, I don't have to take it seriously because I already thought about it from
Well, you
another-
need
Well,
to-
you need to indicate that you understand that what you're finding there is specific to the people you have interviewed and cannot just be generalized to the general population. So that is the limit of your investigation.
But I think also the reflexivity part is really important. And going back to the SAW idea, you know, about what you have done and the attitude that you have taken and how you have guarded against bringing yourself and your own ideas and what you hoped that you would find into the research. So that's the part of how you would kind of argue that is about the reflexivity is a huge part of SEA research because you have to be really careful about your own position in the research. And so you need to put that front and center about how you have addressed that. And then allow yourself to be with the participants in that way of kind of co-creating meaning through the dialogue.
Just like you would do in therapy. You're not going to the therapy session expecting your client to fit in with the best way of living. You're working with their way of living. And what we want to know about is how people actually do experience certain things and how they do live. And, you know, figuring out how that might be different in different circumstances or in different cultures or in different times. We've had lots of students doing research about, gosh, you have examples in your head, I'm sure, in various African countries, what people have experienced in terms of genital mutilation, for instance, or, you know, things that we wouldn't even know about in a Western experience. So it can be very culturally specific sometimes, or it could be a comparison of women's experiences of their sexuality. And then you look at people from different backgrounds. You can do this in many different ways, but you always delimit it very clearly to what it is you're investigating. And it never is everything. There's always a limit.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.